The knit stitch is the most basic knitting stitch there is, and it's also the most commonly used. When you're working rows of knit stitches, you're going to be creating flat V stitches, which are these in between these ridges here. The back of a knit row is what is called a purl row, and that's what these raised bumps are here, these purl bumps. So when you're knitting every row, you're creating a fabric that looks like this. This is called garter stitch. When you do one row of knitting, the back of that stitch is going to be purl. And then you're working this side of the fabric on the second row, creating this knit stitch along here, which then creates a purl row on the back. So the garter stitch fabric is something that looks identical on both sides. If you were to knit one row and then purl one row, you would be creating something called stockinette fabric, which looks like this. These are all knit stitches, as you can see now more clearly, the little V's. The back of this, of stockinette, is all purl bumps, all purl rows. So first I'm going to be showing you how to work the knit stitch. If you followed my tutorial for the cable cast on, you should have stitches on your left needle that look somewhat like this. You can make entire garments and projects using nothing but this knit stitch alone, so it's a wonderful one to learn how to do. It's, again, the most basic that you will ever need to do. Okay, in this video, I'm going to be demonstrating English style knitting. English style means that you are doing something called throwing the working yarn, and you're using your right hand to hold the working yarn. There's also something called continental style knitting, which is where you hold the yarn in the left hand and you do something called picking with the right needle. English style is the most basic for beginners to learn. I think it's a little bit easier, so that's what I'm going to be demonstrating today. The first thing you want to do is place your needle with all of your stitches in your left hand. We're going to be working down this row into every single stitch, transferring them to the right needle as we're creating new stitches. The first thing you want to do then is insert this right needle up into the first stitch on the left needle. Now, in the cable cast on, we went on under both of the legs of that first stitch. For the purpose of knitting, we're only going to go up the front of the stitch. Similar to the cable cast on, you're going to hold both needles then in your left hand. When you're working in knitting, you usually want to have about 3/4 of an inch to an inch of space here on your needle so that your stitches don't fly off, but so that they're close enough to the top that they can easily be removed. When holding both of the needles in your left hand, you want to use your right hand to manipulate the working yarn. You're going to take this working yarn, wrap it around the right needle and in between the two. Now you're going to replace the right needle and the working yarn in your right hand. You're going to slide this right needle out from underneath the stitch on the left needle, capturing this new loop, and then you're going to slide the entire old stitch off of the left needle. You want to keep this stitch nice and loose so that when you work down the next row, you're going to have enough space to insert the needle into it. So again, now we're on the second stitch. We're going to insert this right needle up into the front of the stitch only. We're going to use our right hand to wrap the working yarn around the right needle and in between the two. Slide the right needle out from underneath that stitch on the left needle, capturing this new loop, and then pull that first stitch off the left needle. So as you can see, we're one by one transferring a stitch from this needle to this while creating the new stitch. So insert that up into the stitch, take your working yarn, wrap it around the back of the right needle only, in between the two, slide that right needle out from underneath, and lift that stitch off of the left needle. And this is the knit stitch. You're just going to continue this down your row, working one stitch at a time, sliding these stitches up closer to the tip of the needle as you need to work them. And I'm going to go ahead and work this entire row, one stitch at a time. Again, it'll get a lot more comfortable as you get used to this, and it won't feel as clumsy to hold the needles. You'll get a feel for how it feels best in your hands. as everyone has a slightly different technique on how to hold the needles. Okay, so now we have all of our first row stitches complete. This is the knit row. As you can see, the flat V stitches here. On the back of this work, we're going to have all the purl bumps on the back. When you're going to work the second row, you're going to go ahead and place that left needle, which was just your right needle, into your left hand. And now we're going to work back down the row on the other side, doing the exact same thing, just transferring one stitch one at a time to the right needle. Now again, you want to make sure that you're not using your tail to work your stitches, so make sure to keep that out of the way. Something that always happens to beginners, I find as well, is that they get confused with this first stitch on the second row. Sometimes this working yarn is wrapped around the back of the needle, and it might look like there's 2 stitches here on this left needle at the top, when in fact, there is only 1. So a lot of times beginners add a stitch on each row when they're learning how to knit because they think that this is 2 stitches. So make sure your working yarn isn't wrapped around the top of that needle. Something else to mention when knitting is that you want to keep your working yarn at the back of your work. So in a purl stitch, it's going to be at the front of your work. In a knit stitch, you always want this working yarn to start behind the right needle. So as we're working down this second row, we're going to do the same thing we did in the first row. You grab both needles with your left hand after you've inserted the right needle up into the stitch. You're going to use your right hand to manipulate the working yarn around the right needle, in between, and then you're going to slide that off the left needle. And then just go ahead and knit all of your stitches down the row of the left needle, placing them one by one onto the right needle to create your second row of knitting. When you're first starting out, it might be good to count the amount of stitches that you have at the end of each row to make sure that you didn't add one or lose one. So now you can see we have 2 rows here, and both sides of the fabric is starting to look the same, where we have a purl bump and a flat V on both sides. So if we were to continue to do this, knitting every row back and forth, we would get that same swatch we had in the beginning of garter stitch. That is what we are creating if you knit every row.